Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to do something a little different today. A friend of mine sent me this book. It's called The Feeling Buddha by David Brazier. And you can see that I've been reading it. And I've been reading it deeply because he's a very accomplished scholar and meditator and Buddhist practitioner. He studied with great teachers. He's a psychotherapist in London, and he's in the order of Amida Buddha, and it's a community that's dedicated to socially engaged Buddhism. So he has a lot to recommend him. And my friend who sent this to me thought that I would enjoy it. And it's more than enjoyable. And I'll tell you why. So everyone knows the Four Noble Truths. Suffering exists. There's a cause to suffering. There's a way to escape suffering, and then the Eightfold Path is that way. And there's a kind of orthodoxy that's developed on a couple of fronts, I think, or I've felt this for a long time. One is that Buddha is primarily talking about mental suffering, mental events. And the orthodoxy is that suffering is caused by craving, and that craving is our thirst or our attachment for certain things, and that if we end that, we end the suffering, and that it disappears. And that's always felt to me insubstantial and fundamentally wrong. Many people, including myself, used to feel that, if I could just get enlightened, it would be clear sailing from there on. Suffering would cease. I would be in some blissful Nirvana state all the time. And then you get enlightened and you go, oh, golly, okay, time to review. So this book is a wonderful review, and I want to go through it a little bit. Just these, and why he calls it the Feeling Buddha. Because part of the orthodoxy is that somehow strong feelings and passions and all of these things are shameful, that they're evidence of poor spiritual development, that they're evidence of unstable personalities or evocations of greed and hatred and delusion. And there's an important nuance that's overlooked that David Brazier spells out really clearly and carefully. So here are the Four Noble Truths, the actual words that Buddha used. Dukkha, samudaya, nirodha, and marga. And I'm going to explain them, and you'll see where this is going. So the first noble truth is dukkha. It's the one that a lot of Buddhist scholars have translated as suffering, which, I don't know, strikes me as a little Protestant or something. That's not exactly right. Other people have suggested things like unease, anxiety, feeling that things aren't quite right. But Buddha himself was very clear about what dukkha was. Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Illness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Despair is dukkha. Separation from what's pleasant is dukkha. Association with what's unpleasant is dukkha. Not getting what we want is dukkha. So the first thing that really strikes you when you think about this carefully is these are not just mental events. This is a description of life. This is what happens to us. If we're hungry, we can get something to eat. If we're cold, we can dress up. If we're hot, we can take something off. But what we can't do is live a life without affliction. Think about it a second. It's often described, suffering is often described, dukkha is often described as if it were an illness, and that the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path were the cure. And in a way they are. But I fear that they don't work in the way that we kind of carelessly expect them to work, what our standards are. Dukkha does not stop after enlightenment. The Buddha's patron and king, Bisambara, was executed by his son, and Buddha's grief is described. Buddha stepped on a thorn and received a septic infection in his foot. It was very painful. Buddha got sick from food poisoning and died. All these things happened after his enlightenment. So if enlightenment is to stop dukkha or put an end to dukkha, it didn't do it in Buddha's case. So I don't think that's what Buddha was talking about, what he intended. He met lots of people in his life. He cared for them deeply. And even after his own enlightenment, at first he didn't want to teach. He just felt, nobody's going to get this. This is too subtle, too crazy. And then he had some kind of psychic intervention with a god. At least that's the way the myth describes it. And he decided to teach. He decided to systematize his understanding that he could help some people. I suppose this is why I teach sometimes. I can help some people. May not be the Dalai Lama or the sharpest knife in the drawer, but there are people I can help. So we do that. Now, why does he call it noble truths? There's a clue in this. First of all, a truth means real. When something's true, it's real. And noble usually means worthy of respect, dignified, maybe courageous. Think about a king or a royal personage or noble behavior. So to call suffering or affliction a noble truth doesn't sound like it's something he's trying to get rid of. When he uttered this, he wasn't a famous guy. He wasn't Deepak Chopra. He walked back from his enlightenment to where his previous ascetic sidekicks were gathered. And they were a little pissy with him because he'd given up on this ascetic practices. He'd had a big bowl of creamy milk from a milkmaid who found him starved almost to death by the side of the road. She fed him, she nursed him back to life. And from this, he realized that all of his 6 years trying to create a world without affliction, trying to create a life without dukkha, had failed, had taken him right to the edge of death. So when he walked back down the road, these guys saw him and they knew right away, something happened. This is a different guy. So to me, the most important thing about calling it a noble truth, is that it's not shameful. It's not shameful to suffer. It's not shameful to be ill. You know, if you read the New Age community long enough, you start to feel that if you get sick, it's your fault because you didn't have enough garlic, or you didn't have enough kelp, or you didn't have enough something. And there's this feeling that really enlightened people never feel anything. It's just all cotton candy. But that's not what the Buddha said. The Buddha said that all this tough stuff, birth, aging, death, despair, separation from what's pleasant, association with the unpleasant, not getting what one wants, war, wounds, these are noble truths. They're not going anywhere, folks. I'd suggest that what the Buddha is telling us is that these are not things that can be escaped. Life itself is dukkha. Life itself is not something we want to escape. At least not me. I'm not ready. Lots of spiritual paths advertise cures for everything. Lots of New Age medicine. My mailbox is full of, quack junk selling herbal cures for everything from, tingling feet to swollen prostate glands. And we often feel embarrassed or ashamed when we suffer. We imagine everyone else is okay, and somehow we're the ones that are messed up. And everybody puts on this front. How you doing? Great, thanks. You might have been great in that moment, but more often than not, it's a way of deflecting or stopping deeper examination of how you actually are in that moment. So when our lives don't correspond to the advertising of how we're supposed to feel as spiritual or enlightened beings, we feel ashamed. So calling suffering, calling dukkha a noble truth, should put that to rest. How can you feel ashamed about what's real? And how can you feel ashamed of what's noble? Buddha picked these words out carefully. Dukkha. 4 noble truths. I don't think we stress it enough. So Buddha's father tried to create a life free of affliction for him. He had a castle, he had huge grounds, he could hunt, he could play, he had mistresses, he had the best food, he had a loving wife, he had a child, who, by the way, he traveled with later for much of his life. So the idea that he was a solitary, ascetic guy removed from the world is another mistranslation. He had an aunt, he had a wife, he had children that later traveled with him as part of his retinue. His father tried to build him this life without affliction, and it just didn't work. It wasn't authentic. And as the myth would have it, he went out in the world with his charioteer, and he ran smack head on into old age, death, suffering of every variety. And there was no question but that it was real. And the tension between the mythic reality that his father had created and coming to terms with reality led Buddha to leave home and become a mendicant and an ascetic. So Buddha knew that as long as we lived, we would meet affliction. He wanted us to meet it well. You could say that his expression of a spiritual quest is the opposite of fleeing suffering. It's learning to face it and finding your joy in spite of it, because it is reality. He did not teach us that we'll never be depressed or unhappy. He didn't say this. He didn't teach us how to avoid suffering. He taught us how not to be defeated by it. So in this book, David Brazier says of the Buddha, he did not put himself above us. He did not claim divinity. He showed us a way to live with reality, with all its alternations and all the emotions and internal changes that result from them, and to see that all those changes and all those results are our actual path. In 1100, the great Japanese Zen master Dogen understood this clearly. He said, quote, "The most important issue for Buddhists is how to get a completely clear appreciation of life and death, birth and death. Buddha, in other words, enlightenment, exists within birth and death. So birth and death as a problem vanish. Enlightenment is right there with them. Enlightenment doesn't skip us over, go directly to jail. Birth and death as reality are nirvana. This is it. If you see this, you won't seek nirvana by trying to avoid birth and death. This is all Dogen speaking. This is the way to be free from birth and death. We're not running away from birth and death. Whatever we run away from, we're chained to. So we're doing something else. Let's see what it is. It's a misinterpretation to think that Buddha is saying all life is suffering. It's everything. It's suffering, it's joy, it's illness, it's great health, it's hatred, it's love, it's anger, it's affection, it's all of it. You can't pour a quart into a pint glass. Reality is all of it. And you can't get just the parts of it you like. We can't get the joy without the pain. We can't get the birth without the dying. We can't get health without illness. They come together. There's no escaping it. It's true that Buddhist practice leads to happiness, but not by delivering us over a fence into some other alternate state, some mental state where there's no more ripples of wind across the water. It doesn't achieve this by destroying dukkha, but by finding our happiness within it. I'm alive. I'm suffering. I'm alive. If I was dead, I wouldn't feel anything. I'm sick. I'm alive. I'm happy. I'm alive. You don't get one without the other. It's a Korean Zen master named Kyung-hao, lived in the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And he really puts his finger on this. He says, don't ask for perfect health. That's just greedy. Make medicine from the suffering and sickness. Don't hope to be without problems. That's just laziness. accept life's difficulties. Don't expect your path to be free from obstacles. Without them, the fire of your enlightenment will go out. Find liberation within the disturbances themselves. Close quote. So, where's this leading? It's leading to looking at dukkha as energy. Think of if I think of the amount of energy I expended pursuing women, pursuing learning about cars, pursuing enemies for revenge, pursuing political goals, pursuing Buddhism itself. This is like gasoline to a car engine. There's a way to use this. This is where Buddha's taking us. Dukkha is energy. It's the way that the energy of the universe smacks into us and transfers from outside inside. Okay, so what's the second noble truth? The second noble truth is samudaya, and it means arising. And it means when we are in the world, when we encounter Buddha, things arise. We can't help it. We can't help dukkha, and we can't help the arising. It's a spontaneous event. When we're afflicted, something arises in us, strong feelings. And Buddha's telling us they are natural, they're real, they are a truth, and they're noble. They're to be respected. They are not shameful. It's not shameful to feel anger. It's not shameful to feel lust. It's not shameful to feel desire. It's not shameful to feel greed. They're all dukkha. They're all in the world, and they arise from dukkha. Pardon me. So with no shame about these things, we can begin right away to lead a more straightforward existence. Less obfuscation, less, sideways behavior, less trying to escape the fact of what we're really feeling. Samudaya means that which comes up with affliction. And what the Buddha brought into the equation is to be responsive to what comes up and to avoid extremes. When we're angry, we have to respond. The way we respond for the Buddha is a middle path. We don't just shoot somebody. When we see something we love, we don't just seize it and run away with it. But we don't pretend that we're not attracted. We don't pretend that we're not angry. We don't pretend that some strong feeling is not at work within us. We don't wallow in denial or repression or shame. It's a waste. Nor do we give free rein to self-indulgent behavior. I once had a pin that said, "Do your thing." Looking at it now, it's a little horrifying. I certainly did it. When we lose something, we experience grief. If it's precious to us, it is not shameful to grieve. It is not evidence of some second-rate spiritual development. It reminds us of the insubstantiality and the impermanence of everything. It's why we wear these little skulls. Remember, everything is changing. Everything is impermanent. All the time. The person we were yesterday is changed today. And that's a fundamental truth of reality. So when we can come to terms with that, when we can come to terms with the insubstantiality and the impermanence of everything, what's going to bother us too much? clear-eyed appreciation of how natural this all is what allows us to help others and ask for help ourselves. If I feel helpless, it's not shameful. It's samudaya. Something has arisen from dukkha. Why can't I ask for help? Or why can't I give it? This is Brazier again. The idea that an enlightened person is one without needs and feelings is one of the most dangerous of all the pitfalls that lie scattered along the spiritual path. I'm going to read it again. The idea that an enlightened person is one without needs and feelings is one of the most dangerous of all the pitfalls that lie scattered along the path of the spiritual path. Remember, I've talked to you before about John Wellwood and spiritual bypassing, and you're angry about something and you're talking to somebody and they're just pretending to be above it, like, they're too spiritual, they're too high to wallow down where you are. It's kind of subtle put down, subtle status play. Well, it's garbage. That's not spiritual development. That's bullshit. So one of the ways that we try to avoid responding to our feelings is by our ego. Our idea of ourself is a series of boundaries and a series of shalls and shall nots. And so when we operate through that ego, instead of just being open and transparent to the world as it comes in and what we really feel, our ego stops us from being fluid and allows us to block feelings which don't correspond to our ideas of ourselves, which is really a fiction, something we've made up. This often leads us, by the way, in my case certainly, to a search for oblivion. We blot it out. In my case, it was heavy drugs, but it could be gambling, could be illicit sexual stuff, could be shopping too much, could be eating too much. They're all to distract us from the inner life, the feelings that rock us off balance. It's common behavior. It can also lead us to work on getting rid of our bad feelings, which is crazy. The problem is not that we have them. The problem is that we're attached to them, and we haven't yet learned how to let them be, which is what meditation teaches us. So we come to the third noble truth. So the first two noble truths, dukkha and samudaya, just happen to us. If you're on earth, these things are going to happen. The next two, nirodha and marga, show us that we can do something about it. There's a path to get rid of suffering. So nirodha means containment. And the word itself is very specific. Rodha meant, it was a description of a bank of earth that's pulled up around a fire to keep the wind away from the fire, to keep it from scattering it. Fire is a pretty universal symbol of passion. And in early civilization, control of fire was completely critical. It was important for cooking, important for warmth, important for all sorts of stuff. But if it got out of hand, if it leapt the embankments, it could destroy entire villages or cities. So the image of banking a fire as a metaphor for containing passion is one that the early followers of Buddha would have understood exactly, something they did every day with fire, which was something dangerous, something they respected, they were not careless with. So when we think of what it is that we're containing, Buddha said what we're containing is the thirst for either the object or a state relative to the object. It's either the thirst to get away from something unpleasant, or the thirst to get something pleasant, or the thirst to change our state, our life, to end illness, to end some condition that we have that we don't like. So what Buddha's contribution was to say, we don't deny the feeling, but we separate the feeling from the object. So somebody does something to us and anger arises. If I take that feeling as the subject of my examination and not the person that caused it, I can actually investigate it. It's like treating myself as a subject of scientific scrutiny. Wow, that got me really angry. And as long as it's contained, it's not dangerous at all. And one of the things that meditation teaches us, and the Eightfold Path teaches us, is that everything can be contained. That when we come to trust the posture of Zazen, the concentration of Zazen, we develop the courage to encounter any feeling, any state whatsoever, and remain immobile. But remain engaged with it. Look at it. Wow, where is it in my body? What part of what he said or she did really triggered me? What was it? Buddhist practice concentrates on using this energy, the transformation of dukkha into arising, for constructive purposes. If you think about it, if you think about a tidal engine, which is one of the sustainable sources of energy that they talk about, putting these big devices in the ocean, and as they move back and forth by the tide, they generate electricity. Well, our passions move back and forth between pleasure and pain and all the nuances, but it's all energy. It's all oscillation and change. It's changing states. And that changing state is our raw energy. And by containing it, we can use it for what we want. It's like gasoline in a car. Gasoline's pretty volatile. It's pretty dangerous. But you subject it to the discipline of being within an engine block and being compressed by a piston and being ignited by a spark. Its energy is turned into rotating energy, which is turned by the differential into another rotating energy, and we're buzzing around. It's not a danger. It's not a threat. Brazier puts it this way: we capture our own inner fire to change the world. When we notice greed arising, we notice what it's directed toward, and we unhook it. Unhook the feeling from the object, and we work on the feeling. We conserve the energy for a higher purpose. That's what we're doing. We're not trying to be not human. We're trying to use the raw material of humanity to live dignified, helpful, constructive lives we can be proud of. If we're concentrating on just feeling good all the time, we're not doing a spiritual practice. We're expressing greed in another way, because that's at odds with the world that we're in. Just ain't happening. So it's a common Buddhist doctrine that craving creates dukkha, and that the end of craving eliminates it. That's kind of widely accepted. If you go to any Buddhist group, most Buddhist groups around, that's what you're going to hear. Craving creates dukkha. And if we end craving, we eliminate it. But Buddha said life is dukkha. Birth is dukkha. So if birth is dukkha, oh, it must have been some craving in a previous life that created this birth. It's pretty hard to avoid that implication. And so the Four Noble Truths get drafted all the time to be the kind of proof for previous lives and afterlives and, talking to dead spirits and what have you. But that's really from an older Hindu perspective. It's an orthodoxy that enlightenment is going to free us from that cycle. It's just not Buddha's teachings. Buddha is teaching us to live well in this life. Who knows about other lives, past lives? Maybe. I've actually met Tibetan priests who were, I forget what you call them. They were supposed to be reincarnated. I thought maybe someone would tell me. Anyway, it begins with an R. And they've just said to me, I don't know. They told me that I'm that guy. So it's not necessary to know about your past life to practice in this life. And that's not where Buddha is trying to teach you. It's just the idea of rebirth is unnecessary to understand the Four Noble Truths. Nirvana is not a metaphor for the peace of death. It's a practical term for a life that controls the fire inside it. It's your furnace. We don't get frightened when the furnace goes on in our house because we know it's contained. So the important point to take away from this is that what arises can be contained. And having confidence in that is what allows us to go forward. So the fourth noble truth, marga, means path or track. So let's just get one thing straight, which is that Buddhism is full of vivid, colorful, outrageous people, courageous people. Some of them were murderers. Some of them were thieves. They went on to become enlightened men and women sharing the deepest wisdom available to us. And the idea that enlightenment made them into spiritual vanilla is ridiculous. And we should take it out in the backyard and shoot it. Yes, it's true that the middle class does not, the middle path does not urge indulgence and doing your thing whenever you want. But what does it do? It harnesses our energy so that we can transform it into the service of what is good and serviceable and worthwhile, so that our short stay on earth can be meaningful, something we can be proud of. So the legend of Buddha clearly tells of his early years of self-defeating struggle to end suffering, starving himself to death. I mentioned this. So when we talk about the Eightfold Path, and we talk about right view, right action, right livelihood, the translation of right, the Pali or Sanskrit word for right, actually had the implication of a current flowing in the middle of a river. So on the edges of the river, there's all these back eddies and there's all this roiling, which could be construed as self-defeating behavior where we conflict with ourselves and we're not all lined up and moving down the center of the river. So it's the middle in the sense of being in the mainstream of life and not being divided against oneself. That's what we're looking for. We're not looking to all be Buddha. Buddha's disciples were very varied. They were very different. What they had in common was that they were authentic. They stepped aside from their ego and their little manufactured personality to let the power of the universe blow through them. They learned to meditate. They learned to harness their feelings. They learned not to fear them. They learn to observe them. They learn to transform them. That's what the Eightfold Path is. Anger may rage in us, and we need to know it, but we don't shoot somebody just because we're angry. We can say, I'm experiencing anger. We don't have to surrender to it or be thrown off our course. Examine it while we're in it. It won't last forever. This is what banking the fire means. We take it away from the person that made us angry, take it away from the event that made us angry, to look at it in ourselves, how we experience it. Because that's the only place we can control it. I can't control it in you. I can control it in myself. I cannot let it pass my teeth. I cannot let it mobilize me to do harm. So meditation itself is enlightenment. The Eightfold Path itself is enlightenment. The practice of the Four Noble Truths is enlightenment, because all of them model the Buddha's mind and the Buddha's behavior on earth. By detaching from our ego, our small personality, we can discover our original nature, which is beyond our control. It's like riding a river in a kayak. We don't control the river, but we can play on it. We can go with it. We have some choices. We stop. We meditate. The meditation we do is called shamatha, which means stopping. You don't have to count your breath. You don't have to put your attention in your belly. You just stop. At Thich Nhat Hanh's villages, they have little bells that go off every 15 minutes, and everyone just stops and takes a look. How am I feeling? How am I doing? So just find places to stop. The fire of our passions and feelings is under our control and won't be dissipated in destructive behavior if we stop. So I'm going to stop there for today, and I'm going to stop these Dharma talks for a while. It seems to me that things are opening up. People are getting vaccinated. They're moving around. They're traveling. And that we may be over the worst of the hump. I need some time to do some things. I'm not saying I'll never do these again, but I'm not going to do them regularly. But I'd like to thank everybody for having been so attentive and so kind to me and so patient. And I'll see you down the road. Thank you. Please take good care of yourself and each other. Let's do the metta prayer. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Thank you all very much.